Hello and welcome to a conversation around, in particular, feedback loop number 2 for the Northern New South Wales LHD, Lismore Safe Space Conversation. Thanks for joining us, for those that are able to join us live, and for those that are able to watch this webinar a little bit later. Thanks either way. As we always do, start off with acknowledgement of country, please, and we'd like to acknowledge traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We acknowledge the people of the Bundjalung Nation as the traditional owners of the lands on which the Lismore Safe Space will be established. Also take the opportunity to acknowledge those with a lived experience, those who may have considered ending their lives, those who may be caring for someone currently in a suicidal crisis, and of course those that might be bereaved through suicide. We acknowledge all the magnificent lives, of course, also that who we have lost to suicide and all those who are struggling with life today. I want to share a slide with you if we can, and then we're going to get right into the main part of the conversation. Welcome, Will. Thank you for joining us. I'm James, one of the at Rose in the Ocean. So for those that haven't met us, James and Will, thank you for joining us. Let's do a quick little whip through. You can see that we've gathered significant progress in terms of the timeline so far, and today is more of a conversation, a one-way conversation, but certainly providing some feedback in regarding to the progress to date, and of course with the anticipation and leading up to the next joint co-design session. Anything else there, Will? I think these are fairly standard, these processes that we've got this far.
Yeah, I mean, we've made significant ground so far with this particular LHD, and it's such a shame that we're, because of 2020, having to do it online, but the participants on both the experience and health professional sides have been so giving and generous with their time and their insights. So we are towards the second half of the match, so to speak. We're getting towards the end. A bit of work yet to go, but we progressed really nicely. And I think, as you'll see later on in today's webinar, the progress we've made in terms of describing what that safe space is going to be, how it will operate, it's in a really, really good stage. So I'm really excited to see this unfold over the next few stages.
Great, thanks, Will. Let's have a look at what that might look like today. Co-design Lismore Safe Space. Let's have a quick little whip through the lived experience ideas that came up regarding the safe space, and particularly the environment. I won't read through them all, but you can certainly see a lot of things there in terms of tangible things and things that can touch: lounges, blankets, pillows, a sensory room, coffee tables, amenities, some private space, outdoor space, an area for people to go, a pleasant place to go, and a quiet place to be in, with oils, plants and artwork. Not too bright, not too dark, and with the opportunity to have some access to iPads and computers. Have a look at a couple of the other areas, in particular the staffing, peer support staff with a lived experience of suicide or crisis, to be able to understand the feelings and get that sense of where you're at as guests, sensitive to every or each person's situation, being unique. Clinical staff available in case of emergency. We'll pick that conversation up a little bit later. Look at the hours there, clearly defined hours, as much coverage as possible, but of course recognising some of the resourcing constraints on that again, and or the Ministry of Health requirements. On-call support, the sense of experience, the idea of choice, self-driven decision-making, some referral, typo there, onward referral to other support services, guidance to define clear next steps, connecting with others, and everything is optional and opt-in by default. So some great ideas there that we've worked through from our lived experience groups. In terms of the values to inform the model, we can see there on the left-hand side in the blue box, the New South Wales, the Ministry of Health, the guidance, the sort of the road rules as such that we need to be abiding by. And then of course, the co-design process for lived experience, the idea of some of the values looking at confidentiality, trust, safety, receptive, responsive, sense of humility, vulnerability and courage, being trauma-informed, dignity, hope, kindness, a peer-led and shared experience, the idea of choice and celebration of diversity. Some draft principles that the lived experience group have come up with. We can see there 8 of those: learning together, taking time to understand, compassion is our compass, diversity, your story enriches our journey, pardon me, together, an idea of all welcome. Expect to be challenged in different perspectives and always welcome feedback, and you know what is best for you, and will empower you to make decisions and take your next step. So the responses from feedback loop, of which we received 5 of those from the lived experience, they agreed, and you can see the little quote there. They have some beautiful points in them. I didn't see anything that I would write differently. Love that feedback. The lived experience response, almost all agreed on some of those, or that feedback in particular. The idea of loving compassion is our compass. Consider adding something about authenticity, and unsure about the unusual is usual. Again, just probably some sort of some wordsmithing around that to tidy some of that stuff up. Further feedback around what was most important or not already captured or included. The staff should have specific training in suicide response and safety planning, relevant information about what services might be important. Important to be able to unpack, walk through causes of acute distress and determine possible next steps. A few others there, like the liaison officer idea, like the idea of discreet entrance. Certainly had a number of conversations about what that might look like, in particular with the small town concept or privacy issues. Like everything being optional and opt-in by default. And we'd be cool to have, this is your best one, Will, what's this?
Therapy animals. It's a brilliant idea.
Yes.
Dog or a goat, whatever it might be. I think it's a fantastic idea. A lot of these comments, they do really speak to the fact that the work provided by the participants so far really does strike a chord. It seems to really reflect the needs of those within the community who haven't been directly participating. But I think a lot of these comments here have really shown that I think we're hitting the nail on the head.
Yeah, great. Let's keep going through those responses from the health professionals in terms of the 6 surveys that came in, or responses that came in. Health professionals mostly agreed. Slides were presented. ED is traumatic space due to clinical requirements. ED really has safe and private spaces. Mental health clinicians work hard to assess people in ED, but environment makes it difficult to have meaningful assessments. And the quote there as well, I think they do accurately reflect reality. However, it is quite disappointing to see mostly negative reflections. This has come up a couple of times, and of course, there were positive reflections, but there were some negative ones, which ultimately about is how can we make a service better than is currently existing.
Yeah, very true, James. And I think that is something that it bears mentioning it every time, that the purpose of this process is to look for what isn't working very well in ED, what alternatives that are required. And so by the very nature of that, while we do respect and absolutely appreciate the necessity of something like ED, and it's one tool in the toolkit, we also need to look at, well, what's not working with that tool and what else we need to devise. And so that very much to that quote means we are looking at the negative experiences first and foremost in this process and devising alternative safe space to accommodate that. But ED, very, very critical and crucial service in the ecosystem of tools for suicidal crisis.
Absolutely, well said, thank you, Will. What would help you feel comfortable to support someone to access a safe space? Safe and welcoming private spaces, follow up after access of the safe space, and provide some form of care pack upon departure to maintain that sense of warmth and support in the next few hours/days, was certainly the conversations that we're having. How do you support people when the safe space is not open? And this was the conversation we had with a number of the health professionals and of course the lived experience individuals around that hours of operation. So we'll tap into that shortly. What should alternatives to ED look like? Some great quotes here. Calm, inviting place that offers privacy and validates the person's experiences. Pardon me. Someone to meet you at the door and walk out with you. That sense of support. Interested to see how many people statistically would prefer to access a non-clinical space over an ED space. And again, you can see some of those ideas of what the ED might look like around safe, welcoming, resource for linking, additional supports, some training for the staff and resources, whether they be clinical or peer, systems of governance that support staff, holistic space, non-clinical, soft lighting, warm, confidential activities to be for individuals or shared, and some amenities as well. What What makes it hard for people experiencing distress to connect with the types of support they need? And a number of the comments that came through: lack of access to appropriate resources, lack of culturally appropriate spaces, the long wait time frame, lack of awareness of where or how to connect, sense of not having control over the process, feeling exposed, and previous experience of feeling not listened to or being like an inconvenience. And again, some quotes there from those discussions. It makes it hard for services to provide the types of support someone's experiencing distress needs. Again, there's some comments in there: difficult to provide individually tailored intervention support, dominated by the medical model that are designed to cater for people presenting for physical issues, not mental health issues. And a couple of comments there in terms of time constraints, disconnect between services, and lack of community options, as an example. So the health professional session, let's have a quick look at this. In particular, the safe space elements that still need a little bit of agreement on around the values, the location, the connection pathways, the onward connections and partnerships, the service model, the staffing, workforce development, obviously some governance stuff, and physical environment and accessibility. So the traffic light process, in terms of how we set this up around the co-design, the idea of, we may have touched on this before, but green text is around the alignment between the Ministry of Health, the lived experience, and the health professionals. The amber or the orange is this sense of a little bit of further discussion to explore what that kind of divergence might be. And the red, unfortunately, I think there aren't any red in this, but that is this.
No red.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
But it's the outer scope according to those guidelines. So, do you want to have a little chat through these, Will, rather than me just using my...
Yeah, you might need a bit of water there, so you take a break. So look, broadly, the good news about this particular LHD is, as I said, we've made some really, really great progress, and the concepts that have been devised across these next few slides. There's a bit of amber on this slide, but mostly it's green. There's a few things to tweak or to figure out the details, but there isn't anything that is in red, which means it's completely out of the scope. And anything that's outside of the scope, also, we can't necessarily accommodate, but the orange is always a way that we can figure out how to achieve that, or how to achieve that same outcome a different way. So in terms of location, on the left-hand side, the experience co-design, they wanted the co-located support services, a separate discrete entrance. So a lot of things that have also been reflected in the feedback survey as well. With the health professional comments, the co-location opportunity at Women's Health Building opposite Lismore ED, outside operational times. That's a possibility, and we did discuss that at the last session. There are also some considerations with that to figure out, not just the logistics of that space, but also the location itself. How close to an ED is best, how far away is problematic. Finding that Goldilocks spot is quite tricky sometimes. We will get there in the end. Transport was also another question. How do you make sure it is safe to get there and back? What sort of services do you provide that somebody can easily arrive to the safe space where they need to be? There was a number of different discussions around different options, including cab charges or shuttle buses. But again, that's something in the next session we're starting to nail down and really figure out. A couple other things there, but we'll move on to the next one, please, James. Some questions that we'll have in the survey in the next session is really trying to figure out that particular location. Where is the best places to be? And I will caveat that saying every LHD has that same problem, as well as opening hours, which will emerge in a second, no spoilers. Finding a location, your opening hours is probably the hardest part of the whole process. There isn't really an ideal spot. It's working with the resources that we have and where it makes sense to start. So these questions I think are really important, and any feedback on that would be especially welcome. So connections, how do we make sure we can actually access the safe space? How do we refer people out of the safe space? Really, really important. And again, mostly green here. A couple of standout things. The space outside for conversations was something that was raised. I think it's a really, really great idea, but it does beg the question of how do we actually facilitate that? That is mostly dependent on the actual space itself. And if we end up with something that doesn't have, say, a courtyard outside, how do we make sure we can achieve that outcome or that result with the resources that we have. So we'll be talking a bit more about that in the next session. Transportation also pops up there again in orange in the second line on HP, as well as really that non-judgmental approach to people who use substances. So this has emerged actually in a number of different LHDs. We are conscious that statistically, people who are accessing this safe space are probably going to have a high prevalence of drug use or alcohol use. And we have to understand that having a zero tolerance policy for the safe space is probably impractical, but how do we ensure that it is a safe space, emphasis on safe for everybody involved, not just the person coming to the space, but also workers that are there, as well as ensuring that we have a very non-judgmental approach to anybody walking in there. I think that speaks to the values that we had touched on earlier about accepting you as you are and helping you on the journey that you are on to get to the space that you need to be in the future, both literally and figuratively. So a couple of other points on outward connections. So when somebody leaves safe space, how do we connect them to other services, other supports? Again, mostly green. So the only couple of things is follow up after visit. That's a particular point where we only have 2 FTE roles. How do we make sure that they aren't overwhelmed with the work they already have, as well as doing follow-ups? But then we don't want to leave somebody who has come to the safe space without that additional support once they leave, as we know it's a really important factor. So how we manage that is to be determined. But again, I'm sure we'll figure out something quite clever. And uncertainty about whether and when people would be asked to leave. And again, really a common thing across all LHDs. We only have 2 FTEs, as I mentioned. Depending on the location, it might be impractical for people to be there overnight. We don't yet know, for instance, the size of the space and what facilities might be there. Do we have a dorm or do we not? And so if we have somebody that's there, how long is it reasonable to expect that they can stay there? Is it going to be a day or 2 days, or is it less or more? So that's something that to be figured out. And again, your feedback on that would be greatly appreciated. So within the survey and the next sessions, these are the questions we'll be asking. These directly relate to both connections in and outside of the safe space itself. One thing that has come up quite a bit is the support in promotion of the safe space. It's an old adage that I think I mentioned in one of these sessions, that build it and they will come doesn't generally work. You need to make sure people know what that safe space is, how to access it, what to expect. How do other collaborators within the community work with this safe space to deliver those outcomes? And so that promotion and communication is something I would really love to hear any particular feedback on. Service model, all green. Enough said, but some really, really great approaches in there and ideas, things that really echo the sentiment of the whole project. So non-clinical approach, the ability to unpack causes of distress, someone to sit with, a silent mentor, which reflects a lot of the experiences that were described very early on in the process, where the best cases of being in an ED often reflected where you had a nurse or you had somebody with you that was just able to chat with you and talk to you like an actual person. And so that was an idea of creating that experience within the safe space itself. So everything here is within scope. I think it's all really, really great ideas and very practical and easy to do. One question though was how many guests, family or friends can be supported. It is, again, a balancing act. If we do have a space of a certain size, how many guests can we actually have there at a time, those who are in crisis, as well as we know that family and friends can be incredibly important in that process. But how do we not end up with a situation of a clown car? We have lots of people crammed into a space. What is the practical level of people within that space that we could actually permit? Staffing, lots of green here, some really great stuff. I loved seeing the diversity of staff comments, so LGBTIQ+, as well as Indigenous cultural knowledge and ability. Really, really crucial, I think, to creating a space that can accommodate and welcome in everybody to that space and provide the service that every unique individual needs. Some things, though, that were in orange were such as the use of volunteers, and that can be really, really useful. There was some concern about the use of volunteers and sort of denigrating lived experience to just purely a volunteer role versus an official and esteemed position in this safe space. Some of the other concepts around this has to look for a blended role of volunteering and say casual or part-time. So that's one thing to figure out, but it would definitely help to supplement the 2 FTEs. But something we'll be talking a bit more, as well as the liaison officer in ED, which was really appreciated in the feedback, and I think has come up in pretty much every LHD that I've been part of myself. I think, yeah, James, you've heard that as well. And the idea of having somebody who is in the ED, who acts as a liaison or a concierge, so to speak. So if somebody presents at the ED in crisis, they can say, look, there's a safe space here next door. I can take you there myself. I'll walk in with you and help you to get settled in there. And so it's that connection point, a very human connection point between these two places. However, and I've broken record, 2 FTEs. And so how do we manage to ensure that position is represented? If you have somebody away from the space sitting in the ED, you've lost one person, or do you have somebody in the ED who has that role? And then how do we make sure that person has the right training, the right knowledge, and the right connections in communication to the safe space? So definitely achievable, but some nitty-gritty things to figure out.
Just in case people, and why she said it's a broken record thing, FTE, full-time equivalent. So that's 2 employees that work full-time. Yeah, cool.
Thanks, James. Similarly on from that, workforce development, lots of green. Again, some really great notes in there around diversity and knowledge. Some things that were pointed out was some great training providers are in a local area. So how do we tap into that? That could be whether it's, say, cultural knowledge or particular capabilities within suicidal crisis. That is generally a great idea, but we need to figure out the policies of that. How much input do they have into the safe space? How much do they interface with the safe space? And how do we train everybody within that safe space in the same concepts and knowledge bases? There wasn't so much on the workforce development side of things with lived experience. We're really keen to explore that, both within the surveys and the sessions themselves. Otherwise, really robust ideas here, and I think it all looks really positive and quite achievable as well. So in the survey and the next session, the questions we'll be going through is, what is the proposed suicide prevention peer worker staffing model with allocation of 2 full-time equivalent staff? In other words, if you have 2 FTE, you can split it up between 2 full-time staff members, or you could have, say, 4 part-time staff members. You could really chop and change that however you want, providing it's within legislation requirements. But what is the ideal? And if we have, say, Monday to Friday or Wednesday through to whatever day of these opening hours, what is the minimum number of people we need to cover those hours? Bearing in mind that if you do have 2 people employed full-time and they're working across that week, they're going to need days off. And so you might need to chop and change that schedule. It's tricky. It's really tricky. And every LHD has the same problem of figuring out that Tetris of what is the best combination. And in most cases, I would say we're going to have to work with the resources that we have and iterate. And so the first instance of that safe space will be working within that constraints. It doesn't mean that it's going to be like that forever. But because of the framework provided by ministry, that's what we have. And I've no doubt that the group and the feedback from the surveys means that we can find something that will work for this region in the first case, and we can build upon that in the future with more resources and different ways of servicing that space. And the other question was the support for those peer workers. What else do they need beyond training? Is there any other way that we need to support them to do their job the best that they can?
Absolutely.
So one of my favorite areas, the physical environment, and stacks of ideas, which I think really speaks to how much importance the physical environment plays on experience. So everything from a really homely feel, feeling like you're actually in somebody's house, that's really welcoming, not a clinical space, a sensory room where you could go in there and either experience positive sensations or nothing at all. You know, blank out noise, blank out light, food and drink facilities, which was echoed on both sides of the coin. And as well as, again, the diversity question about how do you ensure that all people of all walks of life are welcome in that space and feel supported. There were some things, again, about opening hours that we're not sure about. How do we best accommodate the opening hours in the most realistic way? As well as, I think it's a really important point about consultation with local, Indigenous and African diaspora communities. It needs to be informed, I think, by cultural awareness and ensuring that space is really accessible to everybody. So those 2 are in orange because it is complicated and it needs to be fully determined how we actually achieve that. But again, fully confident that we can do that. Otherwise, everything really green. Therapy animals is in there. I'm determined to see one LHD at least in this project have a therapy goat. I'm counting on it. So some questions in the survey in the session, opening hours again, which is our main bugbear at the moment. what sort of style the service will be. A lot of words have been thrown around through, say, a cafe sort of style, a lounge, meeting rooms, the home. What is the experience that you want somebody to feel when they walk up to there? What are the words they would use when they leave that space and say, well, it was like going to a cafe with a really supportive friend or a family member, and that's the experience that they had. How do we address the needs of priority groups such as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, LGBTQI, local community, men, young people, older people, etc. There's a lot of different ways that we can look at that intersectionality, and each of them do require something quite different. But having an idea about it and approaching that from the get-go, I think, is really important. It's a lot harder to build that sort of an intersectionality in later on versus as you're building a thing at the beginning. And then similarly, different languages. We can obviously over time build up that language support, but what are the key languages that we might tackle in the first instance of my question? Thank you, James. One of my least favorite subjects, governance, but very, very important. So again, mostly green. The one thing that was in orange on the experience was the oversight by a clinician. The reason that's in orange, I believe, is that there is always going to be support from a clinician perspective in the safe space. That goes without saying. But the oversight, I think, is a key word. So the safe space is going to be led by, staffed by, and really devised by peer workers, people with lived experience. So oversight might imply that clinician has the final say or is managing that space. And that's not what the safe space is intended to be. And so we might need to just have a chat about exactly what oversight means and what does that look like? How do we ensure that peer workers have every support that they need, both emotionally, logistically, as well as from a clinician perspective, while we still make sure that the peer workers are leading that space and that they do have their own oversight over that space. And then a really interesting question was about data. We do know people are coming into that safe space, they'll need to be asked questions about themselves, about their experiences, particularly in a post-COVID world where checking into a safe space for contact tracing is going to be probably expected. How do we ensure that we balance privacy with necessary data, as well as not overwhelming people with paperwork? Particularly now, if I'm being in Brisbane, I'm very lucky enough to go to a cafe if I want to, and you have to sign in and fill in your details. If I was in suicidal crisis, that would be an immensely difficult thing to do. And to say to somebody, well, you can't come in before you scan the QR code, might be tricky. So a lot of questions there around the data collection and how we make sure that data is handled appropriately.
Really important point, that one. Thanks, Will, for explaining it. That we certainly don't want to be having a scenario where a guest feels there's a hurdle they've got to get over, and heaven forbid if they thought, it's too hard to come in, I'm not going to. So
absolutely, and bearing in mind it's important things to collect, but yeah, how do we make sure it's done in a way that is appropriate to that situation? So a few questions on governance. How will the management of the service be reflected in clinical and operational governance structures of the district? What are the key risks in establishing this service and how will they be managed? What arrangements, protocols we put in place to support referrals to and from the emergency department? And that may include things like the ED liaison, as well as other policies to make sure that the safety of transitioning somebody between the two spaces is maintained. How will people have the opportunity to provide feedback on the service? One thing was raised within the sessions about, say, to rate the service, the safe space after you've left or while you're there, has this been a good experience or not? That's really important. It's really useful data, right? To understand, is this actually achieving the goal we want? Are people using the words that we're expecting to hear about? It's a safe, homely space. On the other hand, if you are in that situation when you are in crisis, you are in distress, the last thing I'd want to do is fill in a survey. And so how do we balance that importance, that need with, again, being appropriate? And then how will outcome data be collected and reported? Again, going back to that question about data. So next steps from here. As I said, we've trucked really well along through the process so far. We are getting towards the end of it, the pointy end, but we still got a bit more work to do. So right now we are in the feedback loop 2 stage. What I've found so far with LHD is that this is really kind of the starting the downhill slope towards the finish line. So the survey is open now, and that closes on November 25th, which is next week, I believe. We then have a combined co-design session on December 3rd, 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. That's a really, really juicy session. We're having a lot of different people from different perspectives in that session to talk through some of these traffic light questions and some more nitty-gritty about the actual safe space. So if you don't have those details and you're in the process so far, please make sure you get onto us. We really want to make sure you're there. We then have feedback loop 3, the final feedback loop on December 9th, with the survey closing on December 16th. So that looks like a long way away, December 16th. That will come really, really quickly, and it's flying past already. If you're in this process so far and you have any clashes with those times, please let us know ASAP. Your participation really does make a lot of difference. If you're not directly participating in the project, that survey is open now, and please, put your voice into there. We want to make sure we capture as many different perspectives from the community as possible. This safe space needs to work for this community. So it will be, while similar to other LHD safe spaces, it'll be unique, and you have an opportunity to help shape what that is. But all the details are at that URL below at roseintheocean.com.au/Northern New South Wales LHD Lismore.
Yeah, great. And great communication around, thanks, Will, this idea of if you've got it, some ideas or responses to those questions that you've seen us walk through, this survey is the opportunity to do that. So please.
Well, you never know. We could be, rattling around on a question of opening hours, and somebody in the community has the solution. So we'd love to hear from everybody.
Absolutely. Wonderful. That's the end of our slides and feedback in terms of where we've got to so far. Were there any questions? I'm not sure if there's any.
No questions in the chat.
No.
So it looks like we covered all bases, which, as expected, James, we're the 18. If there are any other questions, you have the Rose's contact details, and the webinar recording should also have them when it's uploaded. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. This really is a collaborative process. It's a co-designed process. So any questions, please throw them at us.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for your time, Will. Guidance, support, love, attention. See you guys again soon.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, James.
See ya.
See you.